Welcome everybody to another class on dreams in this series of At Home with Theosophy. So far we have gone through two introductory classes. The first one was about the astral plane, which is where most of the experiences of true dreams takes place. And then the second class last week was about the mechanisms of consciousness and how they affect the perceptions that our consciousness may have. Remember, we talked about how the physical body has a very basic consciousness of its own with its own tendencies. Then the etheric double, which is a counterpart of the physical body, can be influenced by images that are, let us say, floating around in the form of thought forms and images of that kind. And then we saw also that the astral body, which is the vehicle of consciousness that is active when the body is asleep, then that astral body also can be influenced by external thought forms or emotions or vibrations. So all these things, as we are going to see, normally have some effect on the dreams or how we remember our dreams. So today we will start examining the more basic kind of dream that is what happens with the physical body. So let us start with the reading.
The ego. All these different portions of the mechanism are in reality merely instruments of the ego, though his control of them is as yet often very imperfect, for it must always be remembered that the ego is himself a developing entity, and that in the case of most of us, he is scarcely more than a germ of what he is to be one day.
In the theosophical view, this ego, the word ego comes from the Greek. I think I mentioned this in the previous class. It comes from the Greek that means I-ness. In the theosophical view, our sense of I-ness can be expressed on different levels. When it is expressing through our mind and emotions in identification with the body, we call it the lower ego, meaning the lower sense of I-ness. When that ego, that sense of I-ness, is expressing through what we could call the soul, and in this little diagram you have there on the screen, the soul would be at the level of the higher mental plane in a vehicle of consciousness that is called the causal body. So when that ego is being expressed at that level, is called the higher ego. Now the sense of I-ness in the process of evolution can be raised up to the Buddhic level in this spiritual body, and that would be the spiritual ego. That is a sense of I-ness where the I is not separate from the other, where there is a sense of being but being in unity. So we have the expression of this sense of I-ness on different levels. When Leadbeater talks about the ego, he's talking about how the soul, working at the level of the causal body, experiences the world. Now, to experience the world, the ego, Leadbeater normally talks about the ego as a he. Blavatsky many times talks about the ego as an it because it's beyond gender. But so let's say when he is expressing through the lower vehicles of consciousness, the mental body, the astral body, and the physical body with its etheric double counterpart, then the ego is submitted or is a slave of the limitations of these bodies, as we are going to see. Now the ego itself, Leadbeater says here, is in a process of evolution. At the beginning of evolution, of human evolution, the ego is pretty much like a baby, quite unconscious with an interned consciousness, And as evolution proceeds, the ego begins to awaken. First, begins to be awakened by the experience that he has on the lower planes through the body, the emotions, and the mind. Then the ego begins to awaken in his own plane, the higher mental plane. And then the ego begins to raise his consciousness to the spiritual planes. That's the idea of the process of evolution. So since we are halfway in the cycle, in the general cycle of evolution in humanity, most of the egos in humanity are still half asleep, half awakened. And this is why Leadbeater says that at that level the ego is still a germ of this glorious entity that can become.
The grasp which the ego has of his various instruments, and therefore his influence over them, is naturally small in his early stages of evolution. Neither his mind nor his passions are thoroughly under his control. Indeed, the average person makes almost no effort to control them, but allows himself to be swept hither and thither, just as his lower thoughts or desires suggest.
So there are two main aspects in the evolution of the ego. One is his own awakening. Again, taking the example of a baby, we can see that the baby goes through a process of awakening to the external world. At the beginning, the baby is most of the time unconscious, we say sleeping, and awakens when there is some discomfort at the physical level. He's hungry or there is something that aches. And then as soon as that discomfort is relieved, then it goes back to unconsciousness. With the process of living, little by little this consciousness begins to unfold and begins to be more and more aware of the external world. In a similar way, this is what happens with the ego. But another aspect of this is that he has to learn to control let's say to control the vehicles of consciousness. Again, in the theosophical view, the body has a life of its own, as well as the emotions and the mind. I'll get to you, Ed, in a little bit. So the mind thinks on its own, and we can see that when we want to meditate, for example. Many times the mind goes wherever the mind wants, and we have a hard time trying to focus the mind. Same with the emotions. Many times we feel things we don't want to feel. So in the theosophical view, these vehicles of consciousness are alive. They have their own tendencies. Just I frequently use the example of a horse, because it's like you are put on a horse when you are barely a child, and at the beginning you go wherever the horse wants to go. Then little by little you realize that you can control this horse, and then you start making efforts and you begin to succeed on this. That is what happens with the ego. As the ego wakes up, it begins to realize that he can control the thoughts and emotions, that he is not the thoughts and emotions, and that is an important part in the spiritual process. Yes, go ahead, Ed.
So this whole way of talking makes the ego seem like it's some solid thing that's evolving, and yet it's probably more like an activity that's evolving, or an experience that's evolving, and it's. What do you have to say in response to that?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's as much as a process as our own psychological I is. So everything is a process, and what I call Pablo, for practical purposes we regard it as an entity, but again it's a process that is constantly growing and responding to the environment, etc. So in that sense, the ego, everything is a process except for the ultimate reality. but from that down, everything is a process. Yes. However, for practical purposes, we talk at the level of entities. This would be the relative truth versus the absolute truth. But it's good to keep in mind that idea. Yeah.
Just to say, it's a lot more fluid and amenable to change than we usually think objects are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, correct.
Consequently, in sleep, the different parts of the mechanism which we have mentioned are very apt to act almost entirely on their own account without reference to him, and the stage of his spiritual advancement is one of the factors that we have to take into account in considering the question of dreams.
So as we have seen in the last class, the body has a tendency to act by itself, and the same with the emotions and the mind. As the ego begins to awaken and its influence begins to be stronger on the personality, then this automatic activity of the vehicles begins to lessen. And the idea is that as we approach the end of evolution, in the direction towards the end of the human experience, the vehicles of consciousness become real vehicles without this automatic activity that they have on their own, this elemental consciousness. But since at this point they still have their own activity, then this activity has its effect in what we experience as dreams, and we are going to see that today.
It is also important for us to realize the part which this ego takes in the formation of our conceptions of external objects. For example, when I look out the window and see a house and a tree, I instantly recognize them for what they are. Yet all the information the senses really transmit is that in a particular direction there are certain varied patches of color bounded by more or less definite outlines.
So our interpretation of the impressions that we receive through the senses is very important, for good and for ill. When we see a tree for the first time, we probably cannot recognize what that is. We don't remember because we were barely conscious at the time. But all we see is a collection of colors and shapes that we don't really understand how they are related. Now, with experience, our consciousness learns to relate all these impressions together and generate the idea of objects, of isolated objects. Of course, everything is connected, and the idea of objects is more a question of concentrations of atoms together than atoms that are completely independent from the rest. If we could see at the level of the atoms, we could probably see a constant interchange of atoms from a tree to the air to the earth, and we wouldn't see the limits where there is a tree and there is not a tree. But from the level of perception that our senses bring, we learn to discriminate these sensations, these perceptions, and generate objects. Now, this is something that our mind does, and at some point it is so ingrained that it's impossible, almost impossible, to perceive something without bringing the image that our memory generated. For example, if you see a Chinese character, you can see the Chinese character, if you don't know Chinese, just as a collection of lines, as a drawing. But if you see a letter in our alphabet, it's very difficult to see the letter as a collection of lines. You always see the letter, the concept that you learn from the letter. So this is the mind that produces that image, that complex image. There are some questions.
Yes, Lee asks, why is it so very difficult for a dreaming ego to think about whether he might be dreaming?
We are going to explore that today. Today we will explore the lower aspect of this, and in the next class we will begin to explore the higher aspects of that experience of dreaming and why we cannot realize that we are dreaming.
It is the mind which from its past experience is able to decide that one particular square white object is a house and another rounded green one is a tree, and that they are both probably of such and such a size and at such and such a distance from me.
So the point here to remember, because this will help us understand certain kinds of dreams, is that it is the mind, which it is the ego working through what we call mind, that brings order to the perceptions. If the ego is not there, we have just a collection of perceptions but with no particular order.
The condition of sleep. Clairvoyant observation bears abundant testimony to the fact that when a man falls into a deep slumber, the higher principles in their astral vehicle almost invariably withdraw from the body and hover in its immediate neighborhood, while the physical body, including that finer portion of it, the etheric double, lies quietly on the bed. The ego floats with equal tranquility in its astral body just above it.
So this is how a clairvoyant sees it. Normally the etheric double stays with the body, and the astral body is floating above the physical body. Now the consciousness of the ego, the lowest vehicle in which the ego is working is this astral body, and the physical and etheric double are beyond the control of the ego.
The brain and its dreams. When the ego has thus for the time resigned the control of his brain, the latter does not become entirely unconscious, as one would perhaps expect. It is evident from various experiments that the physical body has a certain dim consciousness of its own, quite apart from that of the real self, and apart also from the mere aggregate of the consciousness of its individual cells.
So what happens when the ego leaves the body behind and it's now using the astral body as its vehicle of consciousness? What Leadbeater says is that the body doesn't fall completely unconscious, as you could think may happen when you faint. In dreaming, this elemental consciousness of the body, of the physical body, stays with it. So while the ego is in the astral body perceiving whatever he is perceiving on the astral plane, the physical body is also perceiving by itself whatever is going on in an independent way from the ego. And this gives rise to a kind of dreams that is what we are going to explore today.
The consciousness is, of course, far feebler than that of the man himself, and consequently all those causes which are mentioned before as likely to affect the action of the brain are now capable of influencing it to a very much greater extent. The slightest alteration in the supply or circulation of the blood now produces grave irregularities of action, and this is why indigestion, as affecting the flow of the blood, so frequently causes troubled sleep or bad dreams.
So while our consciousness, the consciousness that we are saying, the consciousness of the ego, that is our sense of I-ness, it's working through the physical body, there are many things that happen in the body, and the ego is behind trying to keep the order in our perceptions. So many times we may perceive something wrong, but the ego corrects that perception. Or we may have some, our senses for the time being may be working in not a very good state, but then the ego is behind trying to put order on all these sensations. So there is a balance that is maintained when the body is healthy because of this ordering activity of the ego. Now, when the ego is not there, the body is left on its own, and any of these alterations that we discussed in the previous class, like the flow of the blood, for example, that if it diminishes when we are awake, we may feel a little sleepy, but when the circulation of the blood diminishes, when the ego is not there and there is no mechanism to try to bring some balance, then that produces far more important effects on the consciousness of the body, because the consciousness of the body doesn't have this ability to try to keep a balance at the level of consciousness. It knows how to keep a balance at the physical level and start different chemical reactions to try the body to try to keep the body working, but at the level of consciousness it doesn't have that ability. So things that affect the body may generate chaotic images in the physical consciousness, the consciousness of the physical elemental.
Even when undisturbed, this strange, dim consciousness has many remarkable peculiarities. Its action seems to be to a great extent automatic, and the results are usually incoherent, senseless, and hopelessly confused. It seems unable to apprehend an idea except in the form of a scene in which it itself is an actor, and therefore all stimuli, whether from within or without, are forthwith translated into perceptual images. It is incapable of grasping abstract ideas or memories as such. They immediately become imaginary percepts.
So this physical consciousness, as we were saying, is a very basic one. This is why it is called the physical elemental. It's a very elemental consciousness, and it's not able to understand anything that is abstract. So as we are going to see several examples, so I don't want to talk about them right now, but if there is something that is happening at the level of the ego, on the astral plane, and the physical memory happens to perceive that, it will immediately generate an image, because it's not, as Leadbeater says there, it's not able to retain a concept. And this image is not necessarily going to be retained in a sequential way. We may have all kinds of fragmentary images.
If, for example, the idea of glory could be suggested to that consciousness, it could take shape only as a vision of some glorious being appearing before the dreamer. If a thought of hatred somehow came across it, it could be appreciated only as a scene in which some imaginary actor showed violent hatred towards the sleeper.
So, in the dreamers that come from this level, the dreams that come from this particular level, you can have several images that do not necessarily correlate to reality. So as we were saying, you may have there an idea of this glory, or an idea of something that can be good or bad, but when it is translated by the brain, it is interpreted in terms of an image. So we need to learn to recognize the physical dreams from more real dreams, and we are going to see, as we go to all the different levels of the dreams, we will see how we can recognize from where it comes.
Any passing thought suggesting a country could image itself only as an actual instantaneous transportation to it, and the dreamer would suddenly find himself there, surrounded by as much of the appropriate circumstances as he happened to be able to remember. It has often been noted that while startling transitions of this sort are extremely frequent in dreams, the sleeper never seems at the time to feel any surprise at their suddenness. In the mere consciousness of the physical brain, there is nothing capable of such a feeling as surprise. It simply perceives the pictures as they appear before it. It has no power to judge their sequence or lack of it.
So this is partly an answer to the question that Lee was asking. If when we wake up, the images that we remember came from the physical elemental, those images, of course, when we remember them afterwards. We are not remembering the dream as it happens. When it was happening, all kinds of incoherent things may happen because the physical consciousness has not this power of putting order that we were saying that the ego has. So while it is happening, all kinds of different things may be going on, and for the physical consciousness, that's perfectly fine. So then you wake up and you remember all these disjointed images, and you say, how come that I didn't realize that this was so incoherent? But you weren't really there. It wasn't you as the ego that was having these dreams. It was the physical consciousness responding to the environment, either to physical stimuli or to thought forms that are floating around. So that level of dreams is not really a real dream in the way that we are going to explore them. It is just a physical response to different stimuli.
Another source of the extraordinary confusion visible in this half-consciousness is the manner in which the law of the association of ideas works in it. We are all familiar with the wonderful instantaneous action of this law in waking life. We know how a chance word, a strain of music, even the scent of a flower may be sufficient to bring back to the mind a change of long-forgotten memories.
So there is this tendency in our being to associate ideas, and we may hear music, as Leadbeater says there, and end up thinking of something completely unrelated, or that appears to be completely unrelated at the end, like a trip that we had someplace. So this association of ideas bring all images that are related only in a very indirect way, but do not belong to a real sequence of things that happen. And this has an impact also in how the physical consciousness interprets these phenomena.
Now, in the sleeping brain, this law is as active as ever, but it acts under curious limitations. Every such association of ideas, whether abstract or concrete, becomes a mere combination of images. As our association of ideas is often of events really entirely unconnected, it may readily be seen that the most inextricable confusion of these images is of frequent occurrence. Naturally enough, a succession of such pictures is rarely perfectly recoverable by memory, since there is no order to help in recovery.
So the physical consciousness also does this, but since these images don't belong to a real sequence, they are just associations, they come to the physical consciousness in no order at all. Or even if they come in an order, the physical consciousness cannot recognize the sequence. Again, remember that all this higher level interpretation of perceptions belongs to the ego, not to the physical senses themselves. So many times when we wake up and have this hazy idea of a dream that was kind of chaotic, many different things, and we cannot really remember what was going on, this is the source of those dreams. And something that is important for memory is the sequence. For example, you can remember the order of many letters if they are concepts. You can remember the sentence as an association of ideas, and then you can repeat the order of the letters. if I give you the same amount of letters with no order, it's very difficult to remember them. So the same happens with these dreams. If the dream doesn't have a sequence, it's very difficult to remember it. And that's the kind of dreams that we are exploring right now, the ones that just come from the physical consciousness.
Another peculiarity of this curious consciousness of the brain is that while singularly sensitive to the slightest external influences, such as sounds or touches, it yet magnifies and distorts them to an almost incredible degree. Among the stories most commonly told is one of a man who had a painful dream of being hanged because his shirt collar was too tight. Another person magnified the prick of a pin into a fatal stab received in a duel. Another translated a slight pinch into the bite of a wild beast.
So I think probably most of us have this kind of experience where a sound or some sensation like that is really turned into something much bigger at the level of the dreams. This physical elemental is kind of acts as a guardian of the body, and is always on guard to try to defend the body. When somebody comes into the room, for example, and you get startled, it's not you as your consciousness that gets startled. It's a physical elemental in the body that does that, because it's always in this state of ready to fight or flight. This is what we call the fight or flight response. So it seems that when the ego is not there, that bringing a more rational perception, bringing some control, this tendency to exaggerate is very much evident in the physical consciousness. I guess that this is also why in the spiritual path it is many times said that we should try to repress the tendency to exaggerate. We have a tendency to exaggerate, but that doesn't seem to be a tendency that is ours. It seems to be a tendency of this more elemental consciousness. So when we go into that, when we yield to this tendency, what we are doing is assimilating more of this elemental consciousness, as opposed to keep it under control, if we want to put it in that way. So this is also the reason why many times all these little stimuli becomes a dramatic scene. It is again produced by the physical consciousness.
Lee has a question. Why is it that a person known by my waking consciousness to be dead makes appearances in my dreams as a living person, and my dreaming ego never suspects that that person has already died?
We are going to explore that in our next class. Those are a different kind of dreams, and to you it may be the person may be dead, but for the ego it's not, because when we say that the person is dead, all we are saying is that the person doesn't have a physical body anymore. So in your waking consciousness you cannot relate to that. But every time we go to sleep, if we are aware at all on the astral plane, we relate to dead people as we relate to living people too. But so for you on the astral plane, that doesn't make any difference, and is a matter of common occurrence. But we are going to discuss that in the next class. Right now we are seeing the more basic kind of dreams that we need to learn to recognize and to leave aside if when we regard the reality of dreams. Whenever there is a dream that seems chaotic, whenever there is a dream that doesn't really have a sequence or some intelligence behind, whenever there is something that is induced by external stimuli, then we can be pretty much sure that that is not a real dream of our consciousness, that is an activity of the physical elemental.
It must by this time be evident that even from this bodily brain alone there comes enough confusion and exaggeration to account for many of the dream phenomena, but this is only one of the factors that we have to take into consideration.
as we are going to see, this activity may be happening along with some more real experience of the ego on the astral plane. So when the experience on the astral plane is being impressed in memory, and that happens when the ego comes back to the body, then that memory that is being trying to be impressed in the brain gets confused with all these other things that may have been going on at the time with the brain. So many times we have this kind of mixtures between a real experience and what the physical brain, or as we are going to see, the etheric brain, were doing. So again, there is, when trying to interpret dreams, it is so, normally it is difficult for most people, and you can see so many different kind of theories and explanation, and it is usually because there is not a knowledge of all the different levels of experience that come into what we call a dream that we remember. But knowing about this, and with a certain training during our daily life, we can minimize the lower experiences, the experience of the elemental consciousness, and we can train ourselves to retain a purer memory of what really goes on the inner planes.
I'm sorry.
Question.
There is a question. What about dreams that involve elements like water and air? Say I fly a lot in my dreams and also walk on the surface of water.
Yeah, again, those are astral experiences that we are going to explore in our next class and in the others. And probably the next one will set up the foundation to understand these kind of experiences. And in the following class, we are going to really go into what kind of experiences these are. But yeah, those are not physical dreams as we are exploring today.
Okay, number 2, the etheric brain. It will be obvious that this part of the organism, so sensitive to every influence even during our waking life, must be still more susceptible when in the condition of sleep. When examined under these circumstances by a clairvoyant, streams of thought are seen to be constantly sweeping through it, not its own thoughts in the least, for it has of itself no power to think, but the casual thoughts of others which are always floating around us.
So remember, or if you are not acquainted with this teaching, in the theosophical view, every thought, every feeling that we have is a kind of vibration that produces a response in the what we could call the emotional matter around and the mental matter around. So this response that is produced outside generates what is called thought forms, and those thought forms stay floating on the astral plane, which is the emotional plane, or on the mental plane, and they stay for a while until the energy of that thought form disappears, and then the form is dissolved. In a certain way, we can think of them as the echo of our thinking. You know, if you are in a cave, you speak, and then that vibration travels around the cave for a little bit. If you speak louder, then it will be louder and it may stay longer. So these thought forms are like the echo of our thinking and feeling. So when we go to sleep, we are constantly, not only when we go to sleep, we are constantly in an ocean of thought forms. As we go on the street, we are constantly passing through them. And actually, if you see, when you are not paying attention, you are, let's say, walking from one place to the other. If you try to think of what were you thinking during the little path that you took, if you were not actively thinking of anything, your mind was not silent. Your mind was thinking, which is really not true thinking, but reproducing all these thought forms that come to your mind, and you just reproduce the images. So the same happens when we go to sleep. We go to sleep and all these thought forms keep going through our aura, let's say. They keep going through our etheric brain and emotional body and mental body. When the ego is there is this, we can shut them off. If we are actively thinking, then they don't even come close because we are irradiating, so to say, thoughts. Or even if we are not thinking, our presence there may bring some order to consciousness. But again, as we said with the physical body, when the ego is not there, all these thoughts will go through the etheric part of our brain and reproduce themselves in the etheric brain.
We are living in the midst of an ocean of other people's thoughts, and whether we are awake or asleep, these are constantly presenting themselves to the etheric part of our brain. So long as we are actively thinking, our brain is practically impervious to this continual impingement of thought from without. But the moment that we leave it idle, the stream of inconsequent chaos begins to pour through it. In sleep, then, the etheric part of the brain is even more than usually at the mercy of these thought currents, since the ego is, for the time, in less close association with it.
Yeah, that's what I just explained.
A curious fact brought out in some recent experiments is that when by any means these currents are shut out from the brain, from this part of the brain, it does not remain absolutely passive, but begins very slowly and dreamily to evolve pictures for itself from its store of past memories. An example of this will be given later when some of these experiments are described.
So at the time, Leadbeater and others would, all these teachings come from their research, let's say, they would look at people sleeping and dreaming and do some experiments, and Leadbeater and some others like Annie Besant had a very well-trained clairvoyance, and that's where all this information comes from. So there is this, the etheric brain is reproducing all these thought forms that are around that may have nothing to do with you. You know, you may go to sleep and then you may have a dream that you say, why did I have that dream? That dream has nothing to do with my life, with my psychological life, with what I was watching before going to sleep, and yet I have this dream. It may really have nothing to do with you. It may be a thought form that was passing through, you know, your room, and then the etheric double picked it up and reproduced it. So there are all these aspects that in the phenomena of dream that are needed that we need to know. But Leadbeater says that even if we can, for example, we can create an etheric shell that would keep the external thoughts outside of ourselves. And sometimes that is a good idea to do when we cannot sleep. You know, when you want to go to sleep and you have all these chaotic thoughts that are not really yours, not when you are worried about something that is an activity of your consciousness, but sometimes there are all these chaotic, inconsequent thoughts that many times come from the external mental plane. So if you create with your willpower and imagination a kind of etheric shell, you can keep them away from you so that you can fall asleep. Now, even in these cases, it is seen that in many people, the etheric double, when undisturbed, little by little begins to produce images, as Leadbeater says, that come from the store of memory. So we can see that many of the images come from the physical aspect of our body and from the etheric part too.
Number 3, the astral body. It will be obvious that this part of the organism, so sensitive to every influence even during our waking life, must be still more susceptible when in the condition of sleep. When examined under these circumstances by a clairvoyant, streams of thought are seen to be constantly sweeping through it, not its own thoughts in the least, for it has of itself no power to think, but the casual thoughts of others which are always floating around us.
So the same happens with the astral body. If you see there on the diagram, the astral body is the one that follows in subtlety above the etheric double. This astral body is what is also called the emotional body, and is the vehicle of consciousness in which impressions from the outside are turned into feelings or emotions. So when we touch an object, our physical body will bring like the physical perception to the brain. But that perception in particular is not a feeling, a sensation in the sense that we normally regard sensation. That feeling of sensation is produced in the astral body. As this stimulus is communicated to the astral body, it turns into a sensation. And when that stimulus from the astral body goes to the mental body, it turns into an idea, a concept. So we say this surface is rough. The sensation, the physical perception came through the nerves. The feeling of roughness came or was produced in the astral body, and the concept, this is rough, appears in the mind. So Leadbeater says that the astral body is constantly responding to external emotions and thoughts. And many of us may be more or less sensitive to all this. Sometimes you may encounter a person and just don't feel a pleasant sensation about the person without even notice or knowing that person. Or you may go to a place and have a sense of peace or restlessness or whatever it is in the place. This is because your emotional body is responding to the emotional atmosphere of the person or the place. Now, at that level, all you have is a sensation. Then your mind tries to make it into a concept and tries to say, to explain it, to give it a conceptual reality. Now, when the ego is in sleep in the emotional body, there are these two things that are going on at the same time. The ego is creating its own activity in the emotional or astral body, but the astral body is also receiving influences from the outside. And that also will, just like in our waking life, according to how we feel, many times we respond. Therefore, the experience of the ego will be affected by what comes from the outside, unless this ego is at a stage of evolution where there is more independence from external stimulus. We are going to see all this in more detail in our next class, but here we are setting the the knowledge base to understand what we are going to see in the next class.
As before mentioned, it is in this vehicle that the ego is functioning during sleep, and it is usually to be seen by anyone whose inner sight is opened, hovering over the physical body on the bed. Its appearance, however, differs very greatly according to the stage of development which the ego to which it belongs has reached.
So as he said before, the astral body is seen normally hovering over the physical body. Now, this astral body has a different appearance according to the stage of evolution of the person. So if you are clairvoyant, you can see the astral body. If your clairvoyance is deep enough, you can see all the other principles like the mental body and the causal body that are there too. But looking only at the level of the astral body, Leadbeater is now going to talk briefly about the appearance of this astral body in different people.
In the case of the entirely uncultured and undeveloped person, it is simply a floating wreath of mist, roughly ovoid in shape but very irregular and indefinite in outline, while the figure within the mist, the denser astral counterpart of the physical body, is also vague, though generally recognizable. It is receptive only on the coarser and more violent vibrations of desire, and unable to move more than a few yards away from its physical body.
In the process of evolution, there are two levels in us that are evolving. On one level, our vehicles of consciousness are evolving, meaning all the bodies, the physical body is evolving, and that science knows some about. The etheric double is evolving, the astral body, the mental body, the causal body. So there is an aspect of evolution that has to do with the form, with the vehicle of consciousness. And then there is another aspect of evolution that has to do with consciousness itself. So when we normally say in theosophy with the unfolding of consciousness, because consciousness has everything, all the powers of consciousness are always there. At the beginning they are latent, just like we would say a baby has potentially all the powers of a mature mind, but at the beginning of life they are latent and they have to be unfolded. So what we are looking at this moment is the evolution of the vehicles of consciousness. At the beginning of evolution, the bodies are not really bodies. If we talk about the astral body, the mental body, are not really bodies in the sense of well-defined structures. They are more like a mist, like a misty form of astral matter that is not very well organized. Therefore, any perception on the astral plane is kind of vague, because the astral body responds like in a very inspecific way. As the person evolves and the astral body begins to be more defined, more well organized, more sensitive, then impressions can be perceived in a far better way. So the first thing that he says is that in a person that is in the early stages of evolution, just like a child, not in a judgmental way, human souls begin to evolve at different times. So there are people that have been evolving for less time than others, and it's just like a bud blooming, and that are different flowers on different stages. So in people that are in the early stages of evolution, the astral body cannot really respond to many things on the astral plane. It responds to the denser vibrations, which are closer to the dense physical experience that consciousness is used to having. There is a question here. Oh, no, that's the same. Yeah.
Okay.
No, go on.
Okay. As evolution progresses, the ovoid mist becomes more and more definite in outline, the figure within it more and more nearly a perfect image of the physical body beneath it. Its receptivity simultaneously increases until it is instantly responsive to all the vibrations of its plane, the finer as well as the more ignoble. Though in the astral body of a highly developed person there would naturally be practically no matter left coarse enough to respond to the latter.
So in a certain sense, it is like if you think of the evolution of the eye, probably a primitive eye can only see the differences between light and dark, and as the eye evolves, then consciousness can perceive the details that are coming through the eye. Consciousness itself has the potential to perceive in a perfectly good way, but because the vehicle of consciousness, in this case the eye, is not well developed, then we find the limitation there. So as a person evolves and the physical and the astral body also begins to be more responsive, it becomes able to respond to all kinds of vibrations on the astral plane, not just the more basic ones. And Leadbeater says that in a highly developed person, there would be naturally practically no matter left coarse enough to respond to the coarse feelings, because there is also a process of purification as we evolve. So the matter that can respond to what we would call a coarse feeling is not very prominent in the astral body of a person.
Can you give example of coarser versus finer?
Well, normally it is said that spiritual feelings of love and the perception of beauty and compassion, these are subtle feelings, and the feelings of violence or hate or separation or feelings, the negative emotions that we normally talk about, those are coarser feelings. They are at the level of vibrations, they are closer to the rate of vibration of the physical matter. So since consciousness begins to evolve on the physical body, it begins to learn to recognize the coarser vibrations, the denser vibrations, and in evolution it begins to be able to recognize finer and finer vibrations.
And what about attachment?
Yeah, attachment also, it's a form, an emotional form that but again, there may be attachment to something higher or lower. So
right, so stronger attachment to more material, coarser
Yes.
things. Its power of locomotion also becomes much greater. It can travel without discomfort to considerable distance from its physical encasement, and can bring back more or less definite impressions as to places which it may have visited and people whom it may have met. In every case, this astral body is, as ever, intensely impressionable by any thought or suggestion involving desire, though in some of the desires which most readily awaken a response in it may be somewhat higher than in others.
So the idea, remember at the beginning we said that normally we can see the astral body hovering over the physical body. Now as a person evolves, and the astral body begins to be more of a body, a real body, then that body is able to get away from the physical body. And as the consciousness of the ego also evolves and begins to awaken to the astral plane, then the ego learns to begin to travel in the astral body as we do in the physical body. And again, bring back the idea of the baby. In the baby, both his physical body and his consciousness are evolving. Even if the consciousness of a baby were fully awakened, his physical body doesn't allow him to move away. The body has to develop more. So in the same way, the astral body has to be developed more so that it can move, but also the consciousness has to be awakened. In a baby, the consciousness too is unconscious, or in this state of introspection that we call sleeping. Therefore, both things have to be developed to some extent to be able to use the astral body as a vehicle of consciousness. When this happens, and as we are going to see at this point in evolution, most people in humanity are at least aware to some extent on the astral plane. When this happens, then the person can travel. When the body is asleep, the astral body can be many miles away in different places, relating to different people, having all kinds of experiences that we are going to explore later, and that can account for the experiences that Lida and Lee were talking about.
Okay, Jeanette has a question. What determines the type of thought forms that come to one?
Yeah, that's a good question. To some extent, we tend to attract the kind of thoughts that are in harmony with our normal thinking. And the same, we tend to attract the kind of feelings that are in tune, let's say, with our regular feeling. So if we are worried during our waking life, then we tend to attract thoughts that are similar, that are, related to worry. If we tend to have more peaceful feelings, we tend to attract more peaceful forms of feeling or astral influences. that is a general rule, but also there are certain things that can affect us just by proximity. As we said, in the process of evolution, we begin to purify our emotional body so that the lower or the matter that can respond to the lower kind of vibration begins to be less and less. But even up to quite advanced stages of evolution, we still have some matter in our astral body and mental body that can respond to those vibrations. So if you happen to be close to a person that has those kind of thoughts, or in a place where those thoughts are produced, or somebody happened to walk by your window, so by the mere proximity you may be affected by those kind of thoughts. So it's not an all or nothing answer, but generally speaking, we are far more receptive to whatever is in tune with the kind of thoughts and emotions that we have during the day.
So if we watch the news and that disturbs us, or movies, or read something, that could have an effect either way.
Yes, and that's why in the exercise that we proposed for this week was try not to watch anything that would disturb us before going to sleep, because if we go to sleep with that kind of vibration in our astral body, then we are more prone to attract that kind of thought forms, which then will produce the kind of dreams that we were talking about.
Okay, and Lee has a comment. What I find most interesting about dreams is the inclusion of objectivity into dreams, such as prophetic dreams and the appearance in a dream of a person who sings a chatty and unfamiliar song with lyrics so intricate that I must presume that the song is not coming from within me.
Yes, we are going to talk about the prophetic dreams, and remember that there is this possibility of mixing up different levels of dreaming. So there may, in what we remember as a single dream, there may be an element of something that the ego was really experiencing. There may be an element of what the astral body was responding to. There may be also an element of a thought form that was flying by and that was caught by your etheric brain and the response of the physical brain. So when we remember a dream, there may be a mixture of all these different elements. As we go on in the spiritual path and we learn to be more aware, that awareness keeps in control our lower vehicles, and then as these vehicles little by little lose their elemental consciousness, then the dreams begin to be far clearer because all this interference is reduced. But normally, many times we have this mixing up, and this is why it is so important, I think, to know about all these different levels. Unless you know about this, if you try to interpret your dreams and you are not aware that there may be different sources for all these stimuli, it's very difficult to really do a systematic and serious interpretation of dreams. At least that's what I think. So this is what we had prepared for today. As you saw, we have explored like the first level of dreams, and in our next class we are going to explore a higher level, and then in the following one the levels that belong really to the experience of the ego on the astral plane and higher planes. Now, is there any other question or comment that any of you have before we close? Well, I hope you enjoy the information, and we are getting closer to the core of our subject. And I'm going to send an exercise as I have been doing in the past weeks, and I hope to see you next Tuesday. Thank you for joining us, and have a great week. Thank you.